Welcome, everybody. We are beginning a class today on the book of Micah, Micah being one of the minor prophets. And coming to you today from Sunny Slope Church, where I've been teaching since January a class on minor prophets. And we're picking up. Last week oh, I see Jeremy. Howdy, Jeremy.
Hello. How are you?
I'm doing good. How are you?
All right.
Good deal. I am going. Well, wait a second. I want to make sure you can see. I'm recording now. I want to give you the chance to see if you want to be able to. If you want to be seen. In a minute, I'm going to mute your microphone just because we get better acoustics that way.
Okay.
So if you have any, and this will go, I'll say to others too as they come in, if you have any questions at any point, just kind of wave your hand. Oh, there's Bart. Hey, Bart.
Hey, morning.
How you doing?
I'm good.
Good. All right. I was just telling Jeremy I'm about to mute you, and it's nothing personal, but the audio is better when I mute you all. So if you have any questions at any point, just put up your hand and holler, and I'll unmute you, and then you can ask your question. So, all right, here we go. So we've been looking at Micah since about January, and last week when we got together here, we went through the book of Jonah, and now we're into the book of Micah, and we've been saying all along that whoops, let me go to this one. The minor prophets deal with the question of how do God's covenant people live in relationship with God and with each other and in the broader world. And so the theme of covenant there, of course, is important because God's people are called into relationship with Him. They're called not just to be, sort of people in the world that happen to know about God, but they're called into relationship. But that relationship entails a certain way of life. And so the minor prophets come as God's spokesperson to God's people, calling them to be faithful to that covenant, and then warning them about the curses that come along with the covenant. Now, we use the word curses. It's not something, that's always kind of we use that word differently. You put a curse on someone and it just means, you're almost sounds like you're practicing witchcraft or something like that. In the Old Testament context, the curse was really, we might use the language today of consequence or penalty for violating that covenant. And so the minor prophets, the major prophets as well, but the minor prophets are warning God's people about the consequences and the penalties of failing to live out that covenant relationship with God. It also has broader societal implications as well. God's people don't just think in terms of their relationship with God, but in terms of how is their society structured. And then what's our relationship with the broader world? Maybe just a quick comment on just because it kind of comes into my mind is what, Old Testament people, they were a theonomistic nation. They were a nation that was they were under God's rule, under God's control. When we translate that into the New Testament, it always gets a little bit difficult because we have to ask where specifically does that apply? In other words, where do the requirements of biblical morality, where is that supposed to be lived out? Do we expect that our nation is to abide by those same covenant requirements? In other words, should we be looking for, when we read what the Old Testament says for how God's people were to live, should we seek to apply that to the broader nation that we are a part of? In other words, do we have to try to make America a Christian nation or whatever nation you happen to be living in? And sometimes we make mistakes when we just, I think, carry it straight across and say, well, we need to Christianize our country. I think better we need to see the parallel to God's people, the church. How do we as a church live in our culture and in our world today? Now, I'm simplifying things obviously quite a bit here, but I think that's just worth noting that the carryover from Old Testament or Old Covenant into the New is not always, in fact, I don't think it's ever straight, Old Testament Israel nation to New Testament United States or whatever country you're part of has to live out that calling as a nation. The implication first and foremost applies to God's people as the spiritual people, the spiritual nation that God is calling it. Doesn't mean that there aren't implications in the broader world, but it's not a one-to-one connection, if that makes any sense. All right, so that's minor prophets in general. That's the overarching theme. We've been working our way through, and I'll just kind of by way of reminder and as a way to just keep this always in front of us. You see, the book of Hosea dealt with the picture of God's relationship to his people as a marriage, and it talked in Hosea. We see that God's people had their sins against God had violated. Was like God saw that as a violation of a marriage covenant, that God's people were in essence cheating on him and committing adultery with other gods. And then God promises that picture of restoration, and it's actually one of the most moving pictures, I think, in the Old Testament of God's faithful love for his unfaithful people. The book of Joel deals with the question of the day of the Lord, and as Israel was experiencing this plague of locusts that was, they're trying to make sense of the meaning of that, and Joel the prophet comes along and says, you ought to experience this as God's discipline calling you back to obedience to him, as well as a warning that another and greater day of the Lord would be coming, and to be then therefore ready for that. The book of Amos presents God's people and warns them that they're like a bowl of overripe fruit that are ripe for judgment, but then it promises the day of restoration that would come. The book of Obadiah deals with the question of Israel's relationship, or better, Judah's relationship with their geographical neighbor, the Edomites, but the Edomites had family lineage, and so there's that question of sibling rivalry, and the two siblings and the respective nations didn't always get along, and the Edomites were often causing a great deal of trouble for the Israelites. And so God promises that he would be faithful to his covenant people and would discipline the people of Edom. Last Thursday, we went through the book of Jonah, and the book of Jonah deals with God's mission to the nations, and it's a very powerful book because it points the people of Israel to the fact that as much as they wanted and valued God's compassion and mercy for themselves, they resented it when that same compassion was demonstrated to other people, to other nations. And so we looked at how God has a vision, if you will, to reach the nations with the good news of his compassion, and even including the people who we would look at as being the least deserving of that, the people who were tyrannical and violent and oppressive, and yet God's mercy is intended for them. And that we looked at in turn how that is a challenge for us, because that again, we value God's mercy when we need it, but when we think about God showing forgiveness to the lowest of the low, or to the most violent, or to the most evil people that we find in our society, that really troubles us. And so we have to examine ourselves on that, and the book of Jonah helps us to do that. This week we're looking at the book of Micah, and I've titled this one Walking with the King, because a lot of what Micah has to deal with is, what does it mean to live in relationship with God as a king? And there are pictures and there are promises of a day when a better king would come, and so we'll see that as well. But that's, and I would add too that this is not a comprehensive description. There's probably a lot more we could say other than just about God as a king, but I think that's one of the main themes that comes out. So I'll pause and see if either of you guys have any questions. I want to make sure I'm not leaving anyone else out of the meeting either, but oh, and I see Shar there. Wow. It's 3-1, right on. So, all right. Okay, let's talk a little bit about what we know about Micah. Oops. Sorry about that. I'll come back to that in a minute. Micah, we don't know a whole lot about who he is. He's called, in chapter 1, verse 1, he's called Micah of Moresheth. which doesn't tell us a whole lot other than who his father was. We read a little bit about when he was reigning, and so this helps us to pin down the time for when Micah was ministering. In my Sunday school class, I gave out that sheet way near the beginning that gave a list of all the kings and that, and so that actually helps us to determine when Micah was active in ministry. But we read in chapter 1, verse 1, that he was reigning during the time of Jotham, Ahaz, and Hezekiah of Judah, and then the vision that he saw concerning Samaria and Jerusalem. So that gives us a date. Those three kings give us a date of about between 750 and 686 BC. So that helps us identify where he is and when he is. He's ministering primarily to the southern kingdom of Israel, and he's a contemporary. He's prophesying around the same time as Isaiah and quite possibly Hosea as well. So that helps us locate a little bit of where and when and who Micah is, although the biographical details are not overly abundant in this book. If you go through the book, and I don't know if you've had a chance to read Micah lately, I would say it's probably one of the more well-known Old Testament prophets, particularly because that verse, Micah chapter 6, verse 8, is maybe one of the more well-known verses in all of the prophetic books, where it talks about what does God require of us, and that it's to do justice, to love mercy, and to walk humbly with our God. So we're familiar in that sense, and I think there's a couple of other passages that we might read, especially around Christmas time. But that said, those are kind of the pulling a couple of, yeah, go ahead.
Oh, I was just going to say Micah 5, where he talks about the promised ruler from Bethlehem.
That's right.
That was the one that they quoted to Herod.
That's right. Yeah, exactly. So the three wise men, or however many there were, they clearly knew the book of Micah. That's right. Yeah, Bart, what's your question?
So his ministry was what, about 64 years? How old did Micah live to be?
That's a good question, and I don't know the answer to it. Yeah, it doesn't tell us. Those are some of the details that, I wish, in a lot of cases, I wish we had a lot more about, but the Bible, God doesn't see fit to give us a whole lot of information. So, but you get the sense. So he's ministering for about 65 years, and how old is he when he starts? I don't know, 15 to 20, and so he's maybe, I don't know, 85 years old. That would be a reasonable guess, but it's still just a guess. If you go through and read through the book of Micah, there is a sense in which it feels, I'm trying to find the right word. It feels harsh to sit under, and I want to parse that out a little bit. The book is overwhelmingly strong in its judgment and condemnation of God's people. You start through in the very beginning, and chapter 1, verses 1 and 2 really are sort of the call to order, and you get the sense that you're going to be sitting in a courtroom as the charges and the accusations are brought against God's people. And right from chapter 1, verse 3, it launches into a really a judgment on God's people. It calls down and calls to attention all of the ways in which they have failed to live out their identity as God's covenant people. And the prophet does not spare. He doesn't hold anything back. He, charge after charge after charge, and you do get the sense, and you should get the sense, that you're sitting in a courtroom, because that's largely what Micah is intending, especially a little later on, and I'll get to that in just a minute. It's clear that God is, and he's calling all these witnesses. He's pointing out all these, particular people or groups of people who have failed significantly in their call to live out their identity as God's covenant people, and particularly when it comes to areas of economic justice and caring for the poor and structuring society. You begin to, and I'll touch on some of those themes in a few minutes, but the effect of it is, as you sit there and go from beginning to end, is it's one thing after the other, after the next, until it feels overwhelming. Now, that said, there are a couple of, you might call them interludes, and that's important because these interludes break up that pattern of repeated judgment, and then there'll be hope. Then there'll be this promise interspersed right into the middle of the book that says, but all is not lost. There is still hope for restoration. There's still the promise of deliverance. That promise is ultimately and most fully, of course, as we'll get into in a little while, realized in the person of Jesus. But the point is that God is, as angry as God is with his people, and as much as he's bringing down his judgment upon them, he is also committing himself to be faithful to his people. And that's important because, especially as I said, this book feels overwhelming in the admonitions that that God is bringing against his people. So chapter 1, verse 1 and 2, it's an introduction and then a call to court. It's sort of like, court is now in session. 1 verses 3 through 16 brings judgment upon Jerusalem and Samaria, the capital cities of Israel and Judah, respectively. Or actually, I had that backwards. Then, beginning in chapter 2, verses 1 through 11, we read judgment upon the leaders of Israel. God is bringing judgment upon those who are in positions of authority, and including the prophets and the other leaders of the people. Then in verses 12 through 13, my NIV Bible has that heading that says deliverance promise. So there is that's where there's one of those interludes where God almost lets us catch a breath, and we hear glimpses again of this promise of renewal again. But then a couple verses later, we're back in the thick of it. Chapter 3 begins judgment on the prophets of the people and on the people themselves. Chapter 4 talks about the mountain of the Lord. Now, in a lot of ways, this is a promise of hope. And I'll say more about it in a couple minutes. It's a picture that says God would establish his place of authority in the land. And then along with that comes this picture of a restored creation. So it's a picture of deliverance and the promise of flourishing once again. And then following that is the passage that you mentioned, Jeremy, the promised ruler from Bethlehem. And it's sort of a mix. It portrays an attack against Israel's ruler, but then it also says, but there will be a king who will come to rule out of that. And so there's that promise again. It's a promise that's mixed with the bitter realities, because if you look, say, chapter 5, verse 3, it says, Israel will be abandoned until the time who's in labor gives birth, and the rest of his brothers return to join the Israelites. So there's sort of this reality that painful times are coming, but God would still send a ruler to lead over and to rule over his people again. Then by chapter 5, we're back into the realities of judgment once again. There's sort of we go on the promise of destruction. Chapter 6 is unique because this is actually the literary style in chapter 6 is that of a courtroom. The whole book feels like it's bringing an indictment against God's people, but in chapter 6 it follows a very specific structure. Nowadays, if you go into court, there's obviously a very carefully laid out procedure. The case is called, and then the prosecution and the defense get to make their opening statements, and then you each call your witnesses, and then you each have a chance to cross-examine, and then you make your closing statements, and then the verdict is rendered. So there's that very carefully laid out structure for a court case, and the same was true in Israel's day. And chapter 6, importantly, follows that, where God is the prosecuting attorney, and he's bringing a lawsuit against his people. So and he's calling as witnesses, it's interesting, he's calling as witnesses the creation. He's calling the mountains and the rivers and the hills and such, and he's bringing a case against his people. And then the case is decided, and the verdict then is rendered in the rest of chapter 6. Chapter 7 concludes with the song of both sorrow and hope. That's how I kind of described it. It's a picture of what happens after this verdict has been rendered, and then but then the book ends with on a message of hope, and that's always so important. Right? They often say your final words are sometimes your most important words, and that's the case here. Chapter 7, beginning at verse 14, fill out this picture of, okay, after you've heard all of this judgment against the people, there is still nevertheless this promise that God would restore his people again, and we're left to wonder how he would do that. There are hints throughout the book, but verse 20, the end verse is so telling. It says, "You will be true to Jacob and show mercy to Abraham, as you pledged on oath to our fathers in days long ago." So there's that promise there that God would be faithful to his covenant and therefore faithful to his people. Now, how God would do that is, we're still a few hundred years away from seeing that, but that is the message that the book ends on. So I'll pause and just see if there are any questions at this point on just the outline of the book. That's a really fast walk through the book as a whole, and then I'm going to come back and tie together some of the themes of the book. Yeah, Bart.
You always talk about bookends. Is the bookends here the judgment and then the deliverance at the end, so to speak?
Yeah, I think that's a fair way to put it. I think that's actually exactly right. I'm glad you brought that up, because that's one of the key ways when we sit down to study a book. One of the things that we can often do to get a sense of what the meaning is to look at the beginning and the end. And you're exactly right. The book begins with judgment and the reality that God's people can't, well, let me say it this way, God can't allow his people to practice all kinds of evil and do nothing about it. He somehow has to address that evil. But justice and judgment does not have the final word. It's God's compassion. Now, we're going to see this here in Micah, and then next week when we look at the book of Nahum, we'll look at that again, because that's another theme. But the question becomes, how do you hold those two things in tension? Right? God is a God of justice, but he's also a God of mercy. So how do we fit those two pieces together? And that's, of course, in a lot of ways, that lies at the heart of what the Christian message is all about. How does a just God maintain and enter into relationship with sinful people? How do sinful people engage in a relationship with a just and holy God? And that's the tension raised by the beginning and the end of the book, and that's a question that runs through the very heart of the Christian message. So yeah, that's good. I'm glad you brought that up. The bookends, the beginning and end of a book, are always very helpful to help us recognize the theme of a book. Any other questions? All right, let's look at some themes of the book as a whole. And by themes, we're kind of just looking at some of the ideas, the main ideas that are woven through the whole book. So I'm not looking now so much at walking through chapter by chapter. Whoops, not drop my microphone here. I'm looking at some of the big picture concerns that God has and the issues that he raises with his people. The first one has to do with economic justice, or probably better to say it as economic injustice. We've touched on this a number of times. As you go through the minor prophets, you begin to see that Amos touches on it, Joel touches on it, other books as well that we will come to later on address this question of how do God's people participate in an economic system in a way that is not exploiting those who are poor and disadvantaged. I'll just draw your attention to a couple of verses. Chapter 2, verse 2, it says that, just read it here. Chapter 2, verse 2, talking about those who, again, it's not specific, but it talks about those who covet fields and seize them, and houses and take them, and they defraud a man of his home and a fellow man of his inheritance. So I'll make a cynical comment. Today we call that eminent domain, right? The ability of government to take houses. Now I'm being a little smart alecky here because there's times when probably that's appropriate. But in Israel's day, the sense that you get is that that was less regulated. And if you were well connected and wealthy and powerful, you could simply do what you remember the story in David's day of Naboth and the vineyard, where the king goes in, and actually it's Jezebel that sort of orchestrates it all, and just seizes that vineyard for the king, and arranges for the death of Naboth. And so you do get the sense that there's some of that going on. And again, it wasn't, again, you get the sense, it doesn't come right out and say it, but you certainly get the sense that this, they were not paying fair market value for the places that they were stealing. And so that was a way of economic exploitation and taking advantage of people and defrauding people. Chapter 6, verse 11 says, shall I acquit a man with dishonest scales and with a bag of false weights? Now that we're pumping our own gas here in Oregon, at least for the next couple of weeks, you maybe have noticed those stickers on the gas pumps that say this pump has been properly certified by the Department of Weights and Measures or something like that. You never knew that there was a Department of Weights and Measures, but it's their job apparently to go around and make sure that when you pump a gallon of gas, that it is actually a gallon of gas. I always think of that when I read that verse, because in Israel's day, the way that you would conduct financial transactions was often you'd weigh out a certain weight of gold or silver or whatever, and if you had if you put your finger on the scale, as it were, you could kind of make it look like you're giving up more gold than you really were. And obviously that would be done as a way of intentionally ripping off, a customer. And then chapter 7, verse 3, this is speaking to, there it is. This is speaking to the rulers and the leaders who are supposed to be responsible for justice in the land. The king most evidently was the one supposed to be ensuring that that justice was being practiced, and says the judge accepts bribes and the powerful dictate what they desire. They all conspire together. I should have read the first part of the verse. Both hands are skilled in doing evil. The ruler demands gifts. The judge accepts bribes, and the powerful dictate what they desire. So you clearly have a system here that allowed those who are rich and well-connected and powerful to bend the rules to their advantage, and in doing so to take advantage of the poor. And that's always been a problem throughout human history, right? The corruption of leadership and buying and selling of offices, whether it be in modern day United States or ancient day Israel. There's always that temptation to power and to exploitation of the poor. Now, this is where that connection that I made earlier. What does it mean? How do you carry this over from the Old Testament into the New Testament? I think is it fair to say that God is anti-capitalism? I don't think so. I don't think we can draw that conclusion, but God is anti-corruption. God does not, he's not pleased to see when you get people who are in business. And I should add too, is God anti-business? And I think the answer is absolutely not. God is very much in favor of commerce and buying and selling and trading. But when you see people who, I think of, the financial meltdown of 2008, 2009. I'm not an expert, but I know that there was enough bending of the rules and taking advantage of loopholes and that took place in mortgage brokers and things of that sort, that you did see a lot of dishonesty playing out. It wasn't just a turn of events that happened to unfold. It was there was corruption involved there. There was people who were being they were taking advantage of people who couldn't afford it. So those are the kinds of things that God is opposed to. I think we have to be careful not to read this and somehow see an anti-capitalist or anti-business bent in God. But again, God is certainly anti-corruption. He is certainly opposed to taking advantage of exploiting the poor. Questions or comments on that? Yeah.
Yeah, it's interesting. In the news lately, I read about, before all this happened, there were certain senators that took advantage of their position and the foreknowledge of what was going down. I'm sure you read about that or heard about it. So as I get, talking about that, it makes me think of, situations like that where people are taking advantage of their position of power for their own gain, and
Right.
so you see that even today. And so it's interesting too that our founding fathers, when they put the system of government in place that we have, several of them, I can't remember who it was, but one of them was quoted as saying, this form of government is only going to work for a just and righteous society.
Right.
You can only give people freedom if they're able to self-discipline, and so, I mean, because freedom doesn't mean doing whatever you want whenever you want it, and I think people get confused by that. And so I think it applies just as much to the leaders, but it also applies to everyone. And
That's right. And we always have to, I think, be taking into account, as good Calvinists, we have to take into account the reality of total depravity. And that is to say that as much as we'd like to think that people are basically good, they're not. We all tend to distort and bend the rules for our own gain. That's just human nature. So any system has to just be honest about that, I think. And again, I emphasize that this is not a passage that says somehow, you see, God hates business and commerce. That's not the point of it at all. Because boy, oh boy, you want to talk about exploiting the poor. There's plenty of ways in which socialism and certainly communism and other systems have done that, even in far greater ways. So it's not telling us what kind of economic system we should have and which one God favors. It is telling us that we have to pay very careful attention to the ways in which our sinful nature will tend to distort and exploit the poor for our own gain.
Yeah.
There's I don't know, there's enough now. You got time on Netflix, or time to watch Netflix and Hulu and such. There's a show, we watch it, it's like an on-demand thing, but it talks about various individuals and corporations and over the years that have been I'm trying to think of them. Oh, the Fire Fraud was one of them. That music festival that was supposed to happen in Bermuda I think it's been 3-4 years now, but there you see again the way that sin corrupts this idea. There was another one too of a gal who had come up with a way to test people's blood, for all kinds of potential illnesses with only a little tiny drop, and it was supposed to be revolutionary, but it turned out in so many ways to be, it ended up she was being dishonest, and it started out as a good idea, but then her own dishonesty creeps in. And so anyways, the point is that you'll find it everywhere. It's not just a couple of isolated cases.
right.
And it's just the reality of sinful human beings. We're bent towards ourselves, and so that's what we certainly see coming out in the book of Amos. So let's see. The other, okay, so that's the first thing. Good thoughts, good observations there. Any other questions on that first theme? There we go. Economic injustice.
Yeah, one other thing,
Sure.
I was just reading. I've been going through a devotional this week, the Holy Week, and so I think it was Tuesday. The devotional was on Jesus' entry into the temple courts, and where he saw the money changers and them selling animals and stuff, and his righteous anger came out, and and so the point of the devotional was to point out that he wasn't upset that they were selling and doing those things in the temple courts. He was upset. Their view on it was that he was upset that the corruption that was going on with the money changers charging too much, and and people selling the animals for exorbitant prices and stuff like that. And it was really
That's right.
a burden on the poor. And so so you can see, even Jesus's concern for these issues that Micah and Micah
Right.
is saying that God is obviously concerned for. So
Yeah, no, that's exactly right. That's well said, and very timely, because you had this economic corruption creeping into the temple structure, so that what was supposed to be a place of prayer and communion with God had turned into a marketplace in which the wealthy and powerful certainly profited at the expense of the poor. And yeah, needless to say, God was not pleased with that. Yeah. All right, let's move on. Second theme is the shame of sin, which is a way of saying that there's these descriptions in Micah that are meant to describe the consequences, and put in very visual terms the consequences of sin. I'll just draw your attention to a couple of them in chapter 1, verse 8, where it says, because of this I will weep and wail, I will go about barefoot and naked, I will howl like a jackal and moan like an owl. So that's a picture of, you just going about barefoot and naked is a way of talking and describing in very vivid terms the shamefulness of the sins of the people. And then a little further in chapter 1, verse 16, it talks about, shave your heads in mourning for the children in whom you delight, make yourselves as bald as the vulture, and they will go from you into exile. So it's one thing to tell people that you've done something wrong. It's much more dramatic to express to them that you've brought shame on yourselves. And in those days, to actually shave your head was a way of sort of, as a way of sort of expressing your humiliation. Now, thankfully, those we don't see a bald head in those terms anymore. But it's a way of talking about disgrace. It was a way of expressing that the people had been quite disgraced by their sin. So God is not just saying you've broken the rules. He's saying you've brought shame upon yourself. You've humiliated yourselves in the sight of other people, and Judah is experiencing that. And then judgment upon God's anointed. Now, this is just worth a little extra thought. The idea of the anointed or the Messiah in the Old Testament is, I'm just beginning to see this more and more, is a really significant theme. I just remember growing up as a kid, you'd hear the term Messiah being, you'd hear that all the time, but I just never gave a lot of thought to the importance of that. It was just kind of like, yeah, Jesus is a Messiah. But in Old Testament times, Messiah was a major idea, and it had everything to do with the anticipated chosen one. Maybe it'd be even better to say the anticipated anointed one. In Israel's time, you had three groups of people who were anointed. You had prophets, priests, and kings, and they were the ones who were set apart and designated to carry out a specific task or office. But all along, the people were waiting for a time when this anointed one would show up. It would be the chosen one, and you get little hints that the people understood it, but you also, there's maybe a sense in which they didn't fully grasp what that would actually look like. In the book of Micah, we hear condemnation against each of those offices. You hear condemnation against prophets, against priests, and against kings, because they had failed to live out their calling and to do what they were supposed to do. So I'll just give you, for prophets were criticized because they were just telling people what they wanted to hear. They were like yes men. And so the prophets, in chapter 3, verse 5, the prophets, we read this: if one feeds them, the prophets proclaim peace. If he does not, they prepare to wage war against him. So it's sort of like, as long as the prophets were collecting their paycheck, they were fine to tell people nice things. But if they didn't get paid, then the people, then the prophets would tell people, harmful things. So the prophets had become corrupted, and were just, they were just in it for the money, and they were not speaking true messages from God. And same thing with priests. Chapter 4, verse 11. Again, this is a minor one, but it is there. It's worth noting. In chapter 4, verse 11, it talks about the priest. Let me see. Yeah, I might have written down the wrong. Yeah, I'll have to check that. Anyways, I can't find the reference, but I have the quote which says, "Her priests teach for a price." And again, you just see the priests, as long as you pay me, I'll teach you. But to actually function in the role on God's behalf, that was not happening. It was a corruption of the office of the priest. Priests were responsible for actually instruction and for teaching, and they weren't doing that. They weren't discipling and mentoring and teaching the youth and the people of God. They were only willing to do that as long as they were getting a significant paycheck. And then kings, remember, Israel was a theocracy. That means that God was meant to be the ruler, and but he ruled on behalf of kings. He had kings in place in Israel, and they were meant to exercise authority on God's behalf. That meant that they were responsible to ensure that God's will was being carried out. But what happens is the power had corrupted the kings as well. So a couple of verses about that. Chapter 3, verse 1 says, should you know justice, should you not know justice, you who hate good and love evil? So the kings, rather than loving what was just and right, they had fallen in love with wickedness and corruption. And so the office of king had been corrupt, and that had devastating effects on all the people. And so and it's the work of the king that gets the most attention in the book of Micah, right? Because the book of Micah is ultimately about who will rule over God's people, who will exercise that authority on God's people. And all these offices had failed in different ways. The prophets, the priests, and as I said, in Micah, most significantly, the kings had all failed to carry out their responsibilities that had been given them from God. And as a result of it, the people had paid a significant price. And so God is passing judgment, not just on the people, but even more so on the leaders of the people. Now, finally, final theme in the book of Micah is the mountain of God. So this comes out especially in chapter 4, where the prophet, and it's kind of that interlude picture. It's sort of looking ahead to a time when God would allow his people to flourish again, but he does that by promising that he would establish a mountain, which sounds strange to us, but you have to understand that the mountain of the Lord is really a way of talking about God's place of authority. It's his place where he exercises justice and rules over his people. And that's a theme throughout the whole Bible. If you start in, Mount Sinai, for example, is the place where God gives his law to his people. And so there you have clearly the establishment of a place of authority and ruling over the people. You could probably find other places as well. The other place that comes to my mind is the Mount of Transfiguration, where Jesus goes up on this mountainside, and he has this encounter, and his glory is put on display, and he sees Moses and Elijah, the law and the prophets, there with him. So mountains in the biblical theme. Yeah, I'll get you in just a quick second there, Bart. Mountains in the biblical picture are places that are the exercise of authority, and Micah is promising that in the exercise that God would exercise his authority on this mountain of the Lord in a way that would once again allow his people to flourish again. Yeah, go ahead, Bart. Question.
So this particular mountain that he talks about here in verse 2, is it different than when he addresses in chapter 6? Here, you mountains, the indictment of the Lord, and is there a difference in the word?
I don't think there's a difference in the Hebrew word. I'd have to do a little digging on that. But my suspicion would be no, although I could be wrong on that. But I would say there is a difference in the concept there. In chapter 4, the picture of a mountain is more figurative. It's more the idea of a place from which God will rule. In chapter 6, it's more looking at those mountains over in the hills in the distance, right? Israel is in a place where there are mountains that you could easily see. And so kind of a way of what God is doing there is calling the mountains as witnesses. So it's a way of really figuratively talking about the actual mountain serving in the capacity of taking the witness stand, because the mountains are always present. The mountains are always there watching the people of Israel, so to speak. So the word is probably the same in Hebrew, at least that's my guess, but the concept is different. The concept in chapter 4 refers more to the place of God's authority from which he will rule and govern. Chapter 6 refers more to the idea of um, figuratively and poetically, we'll say, calling the mountains as eyewitnesses to what had happened in Israel. Okay, so those are the I think some of the main themes. There might be more. Oh, I was gonna yeah. What you begin to see happening is as the book goes on, this mountain of the Lord, there's this promise that God is going to establish himself as a king, and under his reign and under his authority, the people would flourish. We touched on this a little bit, but I didn't point this out. In chapter 7, verse 18, this is again near the end of the book. Chapter 7 presents that people in which you read that God would shepherd his people again with the staff. That's a prayer that Micah prays, that God would shepherd the people again. So that's a picture of the kind of rule that God would have. But then when you get to verse 18, as the book comes to a conclusion, Micah says, "Who is a God like you, who pardons sin and forgives the transgression of the remnant of his inheritance?" So it's ending on that message of forgiveness. But what's significant in that is that question, who is a God like you? In Hebrew, it's actually Micah, which is who is like Yahweh. And if, my Hebrew is not very good, but Micah, you can hear the name Micah. Micah's name means who is like Yahweh. And so Micah's using his own name as sort of a play on words there. And he's really establishing that ultimately God is a God of justice and will rule his people with justice, but he's also a God who will rule over his people by extending them compassion. And it's his mercy and his forgiveness that are so central to how he governs his people and how he rules over them. So there's this promise all the way through that somehow God would God would rule over his people in justice and in mercy. Any questions on that? Then I want to move to, how do we see the gospel in the book of Micah? How do we, again, all of the Old Testament is always pointing us forward to the person and work of Jesus. That is always how, the Old Testament is always bringing us ahead to that and pointing us ahead to that. The question is, how do we see it realized? And I think the first answer comes to us when we see that Jesus becomes the anointed one. He becomes anointed as the true and greater shepherd king who will rule over his people. So Jeremy, you drew attention to chapter 5, which is such an important verse, because there's where Micah, in the midst of this, there's a lot of message of warning and judgment, and but then, and even the threat, it says, "Marshal your troops, O city, a siege is laid against us. They will strike Israel's ruler on the cheek with a rod." So there's that picture of attack on Jerusalem. But then God says there will come a king out of this tiny little place of Bethlehem, and this little king, or this king, not a little king, the king from the little town, will become one who will be the ruler of the people. And of course, Bethlehem, people of Israel would have thought maybe right away of David, another king from the line of David, which would have been correct. But ultimately, that's fulfilled when Matthew says, Jesus is the one who comes out of Bethlehem. He's the king that Micah was talking about. He comes as the true and greater king to rule over God's people. But the idea of a shepherd is important there too, because a shepherd is sort of, it's sort of juxtaposed with this idea of king. When you have a king in Israel who, or I should say kings, who were corrupt and they were susceptible to bribery, and they're willing to take the land of the people that they rule over for their own personal gain. The idea of a shepherd suggests something that's just the opposite. He's a king who is gentle and tender and cares for his people and watches over them and provides for them in all the ways that shepherds did with their sheep. So, you have that picture there that is really quite telling. Jesus is a different kind of king. He doesn't rule with an iron fist, but with a shepherd's staff. And of course, that image is developed much more throughout the Gospels. Especially, you get to John chapter 10, where Jesus talks about being the good shepherd. So Jesus is an entirely different kind of king who rules over his people, and that's he's the king that does a shepherd king who shows compassion and kindness for his people which leads to the second point, which is the mountain of the Lord. Right? Where is the mountain of the Lord? Where is the place that God establishes his rule over his people? Well, at least at the very least, especially on today, Monday, Thursday, we see that the mountain of the Lord is realized outside of Jerusalem. It's realized at Calvary, right? It's where Jesus goes up as the good shepherd, but also as the lamb to be slaughtered. And the good shepherd lays down his life for his people. The good shepherd gives up himself and to in order to establish God's rule. Now that's where that tension is resolved, that tension between God has to be a God of justice. He has to deal with the sins of his people. He can't, no righteous person looks at evil and says, well, that's just too bad. It's not, but there's not much we can do about it and we just have to accept it. No righteous person does that. A truly righteous person hates evil and deals with it. And that's exactly what God does. So there's where the justice on that mountain of the Lord, that's where the justice of God is satisfied. But it's also where the mercy and the compassion of God is poured out, because it's the shepherd king who ends up absorbing God's righteous anger and justice in himself. And he does that so that God's people might experience the compassion of God, right? It's so that those verses in chapter 7, verse 18 can be realized for us, that God pardons sin and forgives the transgression, so that God does not stay angry forever, but can delight to show mercy and can have compassion on us and tread our sins underfoot and hurl our iniquities into the depths of the sea. All of those are the promise that God makes, and it's possible only because of what God does on the mountain of the Lord under Jesus. Now, Ascension Day happens 50 days or 40 days after the crucifixion, death, and resurrection. That's important too, because God continues to rule over us through his son, through the shepherd king Jesus, right? Today, God is ruling over us. He desires that we submit to him and honor him. And I'll touch on that and just flesh that out in a minute. But God is still ruling over us today as our king, and he calls us to be submissive to him. And one day, when the fullness of his reign is accomplished, then that full picture of the mountain of the Lord will be lived out, which is to say that God will rule over creation in such a way that it flourishes entirely again. That's the hope of the new heavens and the new earth. It's a creation that will, all those beautiful pictures will be realized. Micah talks there in where is it? Verse 4 talks about, nation will not take up sword against nation, nor will they train for war. They'll beat their swords into plowshares. Every man will sit under his own vine and under his own fig tree. All of those things will be realized in the full reign of King Jesus in the rest of eternity. Questions on that, on the gospel in Micah?
Yeah, I was as I was reading through this, it was an interesting. Let's see. So it says. So going back to the chapter 5. Okay. So again, with the reference to the shepherd, he will verse 4. He will stand and shepherd his flock in the strength of the Lord and the majesty of the name of the Lord his God, and they will live securely. For then his greatness will reach to the ends of the earth. So, so again, a reference to, and I think he alluded to this early on where, I guess in some of the other previous passages, like last week when he talked about Jonah and how his grace extends to all the nations, again, there's a reference to that. And so I found that interesting. And then in verse 5, he will be their peace. So
yeah.
And it's interesting that peace again is equated with a specific person, in this case Jesus Christ. So
that's right. Yeah, in fact, I'm blanking on, I believe it's in 1 Corinthians, but I'm not positive, but where it actually says where Jesus is our peace. And it's possible that he's actually, that Paul has that verse that you just cited in mind. Peace is not just, while we all play nice with each other. Peace is ultimately rooted in the person of Jesus and what he has done for us. Yeah, no, that's good. And then, yeah, as you said, that picture of of his reign reaching the ends of the earth, that was not realized in Israel's time. It wasn't realized even in Jesus' day and age, in the first century, but it will be realized. So this is that picture that stretches ahead into the infinite future, and it gives us a picture of what God's kingdom ultimately and finally will be. Absolutely, yeah. All right, couple points of application. Who is like God? I'm not sure. I think that might be a typo. Actually, I might have copied and pasted that, but I do think, yeah. So seeking, maybe I didn't mean that. Anyway, seeking. The first thing is seeking God's mercy in the face of justice, and that's sort of a big picture thing. This is always a call to recognize that by nature, the problem that Micah described is not just a problem out there. It's not just, those terrible Israelites so long ago, they were, corrupt and greedy and exploitive and so on. But it's actually recognizing that by nature, we all deserve justice. And justice for us would look like being excluded from God's presence. We can't lay claim to God's forgiveness and kindness and his blessings just because. We have to look at we have to be honest about ourselves and say, yeah, we do deserve this. We are not excluded from this. God hates evil, and he intends to banish it from all of creation. And the way that if we do that, and if we apply that standard across the board, then it applies to us as well. And yet the portrait of God that is presented is also a God who is merciful and compassionate when we seek his forgiveness through Christ. And so there's always that message. And Bart, I think you said it really well earlier. There's a message of judgment, but as you pointed out, the bookend is a message of mercy. It's God's forgiveness that is extended to us in Christ. And so God points us the way here to pardon, and the way to experience that is to humble ourselves before God and seek God's mercy, which is offered to us ultimately in the person of Jesus Christ. Now, I've said before that being a Christian isn't just about getting your eternal insurance paid up so you go to heaven when you die, but it's also about learning to live out who we are as God's people today. We cannot usher in God's kingdom. God does that. So all of our, whatever our good works might be, whether they be personal, whether they be corporate, whether they be societal, however you might look at it, can't earn our way up to God, and it can't usher or establish the kingdom of God. But we are called to think through, how do we live out our identity as God's people when it comes to, say, matters of economic justice. So whether it's at home, whether it's in business, whether it's in our communities, whether it's in, at the ballot box when we cast our votes for those that we want to be in office, or for policies that we think would serve our society, we have to always be thinking through, what does it look like to participate in ways that reflect God's character and God's will. Now, that's much easier said than done, because I am more and more convinced that genuine Christians can both approach the same issue from different points of view, and they can even vote for different political candidates or different issues, and it's not that one is more Christian and the other is less Christian. It's just that they're both weighing out, how do we live in this world? We live in a world that is not a Christianized world, but we have to, we want to see policies, and we want to see a society that is well structured and equitable and so on. So, but there's different ways to get there, and there's different ways that we sort of all parse that out. And so that's different. And I think there's a lot of room for disagreement on that. But nevertheless, we have to always be thinking through, when I vote, when I do business, when I envision what I think society should look like, how do my convictions on matters of justice and equity and such, how does that all factor in here? And I think we ought to learn how do you work that down into the smallest nooks and crannies of life, right? So, we're in this pandemic right now, and you're reading about companies that, okay, some are just laying their workers off. Others are saying, well, we're going to keep paying them as long as we're able to. I mean, those are matters of justice, but it's hard to make an absolute on that too, right? Because you can say, well, you should keep paying your employees, but if you don't have the money, you can't do that. So, but or things like how much more does the CEO need to make than the lowest paid employee? Well, I'm not an economist. I'm not exactly sure, but those are questions that I think Christians will be asking. Those sorts of things. Yeah, being people who live in relationship with one another. How do we treat each other? How do we practice both justice and mercy in our interpersonal dealings? And then walking humbly with God, right? What does that mean? To have a life of piety. Being a Christian isn't just about knowing doctrine and knowing theology, but it's knowing those things as a means of knowing God and cultivating a relationship with God. And that's, Christianity isn't about just sentimentality. It's not about just knowledge. It's about a life of devotion to God. So walking with the King and living in that relationship with the King. All right. Any last questions or comments on any of those points of application?
Yeah, it is interesting. So the emphasis here on, economic justice, that Micah brings out, you can see, especially with some of the younger generations, that is definitely of concern to them.
Yep.
That's something that they focus on, and and being part of Crew, Campus Crusade, that's something that the organization has been wrestling with lately too. Just how do we approach the world? How do we address some of these justice issues that are being brought up? And as soon as politicians and politics gets involved, it gets real messy. But it's like I think we as Christians can be kind of the stabilizing force in talking about these issues, because I think with the Holy Spirit guiding us, and with the the principles that are laid out in Scripture, we can approach these things in a way that is not going to get our emotions too much involved, where because we're just talking about, this is what Scripture says, this is what the Bible says, instead of
That's right.
bringing emotions in, which tends to make the conversation go off the rails. You know what I'm saying? So
yeah, no, I think that's an excellent point, and we are living now in a time, especially here in the Northwest. I mean, Oregon is very sensitive to matters of justice, and I think there's both something good to affirm in that and something to be critical of, which is, look, it's good that people are more sensitive to these matters than they were, say, 20 years ago. My critique would be, you've also made that into your righteousness. You've sort of conducted that, and you've made your pursuit of economic justice and equality, and other forms of justice and equality into your means of saying, I do this and I care about this, therefore I am righteous. Now, they would never use that language, but that's the mindset. And so that gives them the permission to look down on people who don't see things the same way, or you might care about one matter of justice, and you might say we need to go all in and right up front, where another person might say, well, I care about that, but if you go so fast and so far, it's going to have detrimental effects. Well, one person can look down on that and say, well, you just don't care as much as I do. And I would say, well, look, there's where there's room to disagree. Again, and I do think Christians can learn a lesson a little bit from some of the people who are passionately concerned about matters of economic justice, but not, as Christians, we don't make it our righteousness. Our righteousness is grounded in the person of Jesus. And so that keeps me from looking down on other people and becoming prideful and self-righteous.
right.
So yeah, no, that's an excellent point.
Yeah. And the reason I say that, we can be that stabilizing force is because I think traditionally in the past, the church hasn't really gotten involved in talking about these
Right.
issues, and at least not on the broader scale, and I think that has been detrimental to to the course of this conversation, and whereas what you're describing now, people that are becoming so passionate about it, and it's like it's become their cousin, their way of justifying themselves, which is of course is in our understanding righteousness, and
That's
so
right.
self-righteousness in this case.
Yeah.
So
No, that's
it's
right.
like I think because we're called to be in the world as Christians, and I think a lot of we've seen that has happened in the last 20 years is because we've kind of stepped back in this particular arena,
Right.
and so that's what I've seen, and so
Yeah.
I really
I think that's exactly right. We've sort of privatized Christianity, where it's just about your soul going to heaven when you die. And at the same time, it's kind of a weird thing, because at the same time, what has happened is sort of this co-opting of public culture, in which we sort of say we want to make America a Christian nation again, but we've defined that in very narrow terms. It's about morality in certain ways, but while neglecting others, and that's always the danger you run into when you try to apply a very broad stroke approach. Christianity is lived out. It should be lived out in all kinds of arenas. But I'm very, very nervous about talk about making America a Christian nation, because that, for a lot of reasons, because it can go wrong in so many ways. Anyways, so.
Well, I do see a lot of wisdom in our founding fathers, and I know a lot of the revisionists have come back and pointed out some of their flaws and stuff, and which is I think it's good to remember that, because they're human beings, they're flawed, total depravity and all that, but I think we should celebrate and we should look at the wisdom that they brought into founding our nations, because they understood the the proclivity of people to once they're in positions of power to abuse that power, and so they wisely put in place checks and balances within our government to try to mitigate that.
Well, and to ensure plurality too, right? I don't want I don't want my, say, Hindu or Muslim neighbor to have a monopoly on religion in the public life either.
Right.
I want to ensure that they're free to worship. I want to ensure that they have the same freedoms accorded to them that I have. But I don't want any one religion to become established or dominant. And I think that, the founding fathers are working out of a Judeo-Christian ethic and morality.
Sure.
A question of their Christianity is always a fascinating one, and far too big for us to tackle here. But they are certainly working out of a Judeo-Christian ethic. And they would be, I think, I'm not an expert, I could tell you more about Canadian history, but their mindset, I think they would be rather surprised at what Christianity looks like today. Now that said, their Christianity was more of a deistic sort of Enlightenment era Christianity, which looks pretty different from but anyway, that's a whole other discussion. Hey, guys and gal, I thank you for joining me today, and for those who watched online, there's okay. There. Thanks for joining. We'll do it again next week. We're going to do the book of Nahum. So if you're able to join me then, that'd be great. And for online people, tune in again next week. It's been a lot of fun. All right, take care. We'll see you again.
Yep.